Well, good afternoon or good morning at the other side of the globe. I'm happy to welcome Professor Klumbytė from Miami University. Thank you for being here today with us. ICAR is currently interviewing international experts on Russia and Ukraine in order to find out what is really going on there. You are an associate professor of anthropology and the director of the Lithuania program at the Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies. Well, Russia is invading Ukraine and intense fighting is being reported. There's still coming different information. It's not yet exactly clear what is happening everywhere on the ground. What do you think? Which implications will this war have in general? What is the goal of Russia?
Thank you, Lucas, so much for this opportunity. Regarding the war, of course, the situation is changing every day, and we are hopeful that there will be a quick resolution. Russia's goals, I believe, many people already discussed those goals in connection to the expansion of the former Soviet sphere, creating the territorial defense zone, security zone for Russia itself. Some spoke about the legacies of Putin's regime, although now, we see that the war will be the legacy, not welcoming Ukrainian joining of the former well, not the former, but the current Russian Federation, at least in the way Belarus did. So in that sense, probably I couldn't add anything new to these discussions. I think, what I would like to speak at this point of history a little bit is the implications this war has to society, to Eastern Europe, to the former Soviet space, as well as Europe more generally, or the Western world. So there's been defined, of course, as a change, a dramatic change in what has been being built in Europe, the security regime and never again culture and memory regimes. So this is being just challenged and questioned by the current war. But at the same time, what is kind of course, in those videos and pictures from the region, we see those terrible buildings and humans dying, and we hear about victims. But at the same time, if we look from the historical perspective, this is already a very terrible disintegrating event that's going to be remembered by that society for many years and many decades. And Ukrainians define themselves and Russians as well through the history of suffering, through the history of World War II, Holodomor. And it just adds to all what has been experienced before. And human pain, it's lasting. Those traumas are lasting. And I'm glad to see that Putin now and his, I hope not just him, but that International Criminal Court has opened the case. But there is already enough evidence to start the case and make it, a big thing right away to prevent what's going on. And violence is productive of many things, including it perpetuates itself. So the longer it's going to last, the more terrible consequences we may see on the ground. So in that sense, and of course, the accounting should be not just for Ukrainian lives, but also for Russian soldiers' lives. These are 18-year-olds, many of them are 18-year-olds, right, who are sent to the front without even knowledge, as we know from the news, what they are doing right there. So it's not even informing people. So we are facing an authoritarian regime that, like in Soviet times, conceals from people what is actually happening. It doesn't tell us, that this is the war, but that spetsoperacija, which people would very much, Putin knows that they would be disagreeing with if he labeled it a war. So the peace was being built in the Soviet Union as well, and that never again in its own Russian style. And now this has been disintegrated by him, and he knows that he doesn't have justification. The government knows, of course, and they are not trying to tell the truth. So, yep. So that's kind of a long answer to your question.
Thank you very much. You just started saying something about justification or lack of it. The Russian president has used the presence of a Russian part of the population in Ukraine for justifying his attack on Ukraine. But there are as well considerable Russian minorities in the Baltic states, especially in Latvia. And in the past, it has been difficult for these societies to fully integrate their minority groups. How has the situation developed since 2014, and what does the Russian invasion of Ukraine imply for these communities?
Well, so the history has been, of course, kind of going into different directions in that region. The turning point was, of course, 2014, when Russian minorities have started facing some othering that they did not face before 2014. So when we think about the history of the region, 2014 was, at the societal perspective, was a turning point, but also at the government perspective too, because the Baltic states and Lithuania specifically, they redefined their defense strategy, and the major threat was identified as the Russian Federation. And there were a lot of other developments in the region that very much were prompted in response to growing threats and insecurities over there. So regarding Russian minorities, we can say, if we ask that question about integration, so of course they are generally fully integrated in the society, but in Lithuania specifically. But it's not just the question of whether they are integrated or not integrated, but also whether they, experience any ethnic. And this is something that is happening right now, and we don't know much about what's going on in Ukraine itself. But in Lithuania, I've seen in the news that a child who was dressed up in accidental in Russian flag colors were told something negative. So these things are emerging, and Lithuanian government, of course, the prime minister said that we are all citizens of one nation, and we are against the Putin's regime and the war. But this, for me, it shows, well, the processes that we are seeing, they are just, this is something that is expected, but they are created by the current insecurities and the war in Ukraine and uncertainties in the region. So in that sense, we sometimes think, okay, Europe is united, United States are helping everybody, many European nations are helping as much as they can. But at the same time, there are real effects already of this war. And, multiple refugees that are probably now close to 1 million people who already are displaced, who, like in Mariupol, This morning, they were saying there are nothing in the stores. So, so maybe some already are facing hunger. So we don't really know, but there are real effects of this war that we are seeing, and they will be lasting, including those traumas that people are subjected to. Children, elderly, families, everyone who never even thought about joining this war. So regarding integration and Russian minorities, some, of course, well, the way I know, from what I know, the majority, of course, are against the war, and the way it is portrayed sometimes, and sometimes it's discussed about what's going on in the region. So even scholars use that concept of nationalism, that this is Ukrainian nationalism, or what we are seeing. But it's also it's the fight for dignity, for human rights, and for Ukraine's sovereignty. And in that sense, we cannot say that it's just about Ukrainian ethnic identity. We shouldn't fall kind of into Putin's framework of this is about ethnicity. These processes are to not define the region the way they defined in the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. This is just very different.
Thank you very much. And how real is Putin's threat to the Baltic countries, since they are EU and NATO members? In contrast to Ukraine, an open war seems hopefully unlikely. However, are there any other ways these countries could be destabilized?
Well, they are being destabilized. Already after 2014, of course, Crimea was not forgotten, and what happened in Georgia in 2008 was not forgotten. But at the same time, the Baltic states and some Eastern European states have always seen as more radical in the European Union. The Lithuanian president, Dalia Grybauskaitė, who was the president at the time when the Crimea was occupied, called Russia a terrorist state. And in that sense, those kind of more radical voices were heard and not heard in Europe. But already 2014 was the date when I, defined the region as moving towards a different time of history. And I was speaking about the new war frontiers that were being created in Ukraine. And of course, we have Maidan here, and we have all kind of changing situation in the Baltics. And what I mentioned, and now it's Sweden, Finland, it's just much larger, much broader area of what I call new war frontiers than it was before. So in that sense, we are seeing a very different time period with different societal, economic and political processes, and what way it is destabilizing. So it creates what I call temporal sovereignty regimes, where people expect that they might be, or the governments that they might be attacked, and they are being attacked by there were cybersecurity threats, there were violations of the air space, there were border crossings, all kind of things like that, including propaganda about the NATO in Lithuania specifically, that and Ukraine as well. So in that sense, it creates that unstable situation. And as I mentioned before, 2014, Lithuania's defense strategy, they were talking about friendly relations with Russia, and since 2017, it is defined. So it's a policy measure. It is defined as the major security threat, right? So in response to that major security threat, there are all kind of measures that have been taken. And if we look at a societal level, we see, historical justice narratives patriotism, militarism, support of majority rights, kind of ethnicization of history. So these are the processes that are to some extent challenging liberalism, but at the same time, Lithuania defines itself as the fort of democracy, as the Eastern fort of democracy in the European Union.
Thank you. Well, Russia is not only invading Ukraine, they are even doing it partly from Belarusian soil. It's not that much on the news right now, but some time ago, Lukashenko's regime has become, well, since some time ago, Lukashenko's regime has become more dependent on Russia since the protests of 2020 that were at that time dominating the news. And Lithuania has been supporting the Belarusian opposition actively. What could the future of Belarusian and Lithuanian relations look like? Is Belarus becoming a Russian province? It seems to look a little bit like that right now.
Well, it has been dependent on Russia for a very long time already. Since the last elections, even military now is integrated, as we can see. So in that sense, there is the regime's dependence on Russia. It was always there before that as well. And Lithuania's relations with Belarus will very much depend on who is in power. So every president in Lithuania in the last decade tried to kind of recharge relations with Belarus because this is the border state of Lithuania, and they were just not successful. So I don't think anyone has any hopes with the current Lukashenko regime that it will change after human rights abuses, after what happened not that long ago. And yeah, so Tsikhanovskaya, she has her office in Vilnius, and as far as I know, she also resides there. So Lithuanians fully support Belarusian opposition.
You've published in 2019 an article called New War Frontiers at the End of Post-Socialism. You argued that 2014 and the annexation of Crimea kind of introduced a new era. What are the characteristics of post-socialism and why is it over? And what does it have to do with the current war in Ukraine?
Well, post-socialism was a more kind of analytical category that we used to use in our works, but also maybe in public discourse to speak about what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. So there were hopes about the future, democratization of the region, liberalism, human rights, the rule of law, while the Baltics joined the European Union and other Eastern European states joined the European Union and NATO. So in that sense, it was considered, what has changed, right? How we transition to democracy. Now, 2014 was a halt in all this process. And we saw all kind of other developments, not just the war in Crimea, but also Brexit, the election of authoritarian leaders in Hungary and Poland, the Syrian crisis and refugee crisis. And these processes contributed to a variety of changes, not believing that, the history is linear and that democracy is not going to be challenged for a longer period of time. Now it is challenged to the extent that nobody, well, I don't know, maybe some people imagine, but None of my colleagues expected that this may happen. So this is a big challenge to democracy and the history and the future of history of Europe. And in that sense, you know, what 2014 brought to the region, in addition to the aspects that I mentioned, specifically in the Baltics, we saw the militarization of the region. We saw various threats to liberalism, and that emergence of polarized society, uncertainty, and the kind of constitution of uncertain sovereignties and the new war frontiers. Now, you know, we are adding war to all this picture in addition to what happened. So there is, we're not going, I don't think we are going to speak about post-socialism after this war. There will be a new era that will need its own vocabulary. How it's going to be called, I don't know.
Thank you. So would you like to add any additional point in regards to the current situation in Ukraine? This was everything from my side.
Right. Well, maybe just one point, since well, many of us study, of course, World War II history and Soviet history and the history of genocide, and European countries, Western countries in general, and other countries have really made a milestone in preventing wars in Europe and building a new security regime and culture. And it took many years. It took many books. It took many efforts and resources. And now, you know, what we see in Ukraine, we see philosophers and sportsmen on the streets fighting for their freedom, and scholars as well. And in that sense, you know, they are supported by Europe. But what it shows to us, you know, that all what has been done has to be revised very seriously. And Europe has to have mechanisms to keep in mind that, you know, never again is never, never again. There have to be mechanisms to control those kind of situations. Lithuanian president just yesterday, the same president who called Ukraine a terrorist state after 2014, said that only war can prevent this war. And she said also that Europe is complicit in what is happening, that they are collaborators with Russian regime. So these words, of course, we should take with a grain of salt, but at the same time, they are telling us some deep truth, that there is no mechanism to prevent what is happening. And of course, there are all kinds of fears of the nuclear war. So in that sense, this is one point I just would like to make, but also another, that it's just amazing to see the unity of Europe. And that's another effect that this war has, and also the unity of people who are joining in helping Ukrainian people and Ukrainians themselves.
Thank you very much, Professor Klumbytė, for giving us interesting insights into Lithuania and the region, and for sharing your point of view.
Thank you, Lucas. It's my pleasure.